Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming to the channel. As always, if you like my content, please do subscribe. And if you're new to the channel, welcome. I cover a wide range of subjects, so yeah, stay tuned. You might find something interesting. Um, just move on. Just move on. How often do we hear this expression um, in light of people expressing the challenges that they face? It's particularly prevalent online, but sometimes in real life as well. So I want to just examine this a little bit and scrutinize it because I think that it really lacks empathy and it's really not helpful. Um, Now I'm going to be covering a few different subjects, but the one that I most have in mind is when it comes to issues around dating, right? So someone's if a relationship hasn't worked out and it's ended, ghosting. I've spoken a few times about ghosting and my experience of it. Now, I'm not going to talk extensively about that because simply because I already have. Um, but with the phenomenon of ghosting, and if you don't know the term, it basically means when someone leaves a relationship very abruptly, but there's no rejection, there's no explanation, everything seems good, then they're just gone. It's a whole phenomenon, and there's lots of material about this online. But check out my previous videos on the subject and about my own experience. But one of the things that sometimes people respond to with that, and I've seen this on threads about the subject, is he is clearly not interested, just move on. Now that's useless advice. It's one thing coming from people who haven't been through it and therefore can't empathize, but what frustrates me is when I see it coming from so-called experts. The other day I came across a so-called world-renowned psychologist, and she had this piece. It was via TED Talks. I forget her name now, but it was via TED Talks, and she laid out a lot of valid points about how ghosting these people. The reason it hurts so much is because they're left in a limbo. But she closed the piece by saying, "You need to move on immediately," and this was very blunt. And I thought, you've made these all these valid points. It was her own op-ed. It wasn't just about her. You've made all these valid points about people seeking understanding and seeking closure, and that's all true. And then you ruin it with this ridiculous statement. Um, it is ridiculous because anyone who's been in a relationship, any relationship, particularly if that was much more than just flirting or just casual sex, then you'll know that it's being told to just move on is ridiculous. Now, I am not saying the phrase in of itself is actually wrong. Ultimately, we do have to move on, right? But what I want to challenge is this dismissive attitude that it's based on, this idea that people can just switch off like that. They can go from one to another in terms of dealing with something. Now, a relationship breakdown or a relationship cut off, which ghosting is, very different from a breakdown. Um, it's it's not easy. It's not straightforward to just move on. If you've invested trust in someone, if you've invested a sort of a situation where you think, yeah, she was the person for me, and she said she would do this. She's, you know, when you know what you have seen in terms of the dialogue, in terms of the promises, in terms of all of that, to be told to hear people say just move on is so ignorant because it's a bit like, I don't want to say this is the exact same thing. Obviously, it isn't. But if someone loses a close relative or a friend in a tragedy, telling that person to just move on is callous, actually. Um, you wouldn't do it. Now, relationships, it's not comparable to death, but it is a form of loss. And in that sense, I've heard one counselor I came across actually said it's a form of bereavement, which is interesting. I'm not sure if I term it that way, but I know what he meant because he was driving at the point about this being devastating potentially. And you know what? to one outsider might say, well, that's trivial, it was only a short time, or you never met her. What you need to understand is that what people need to understand is that words can have implications, especially if you've been in a position where you haven't had a lot of happiness coming your way, and you get this person who comes into your life and they give you all these promises and it feels great, and then they just go. So just move on is ridiculous. Another one is telling the person, just go out and meet other women. Well, I don't want to personalize this too much because I want to be a bit more generic, but in my case, I don't live in a particularly cosmopolitan city, so there aren't many millennials my age who are single. And even if there were, I'm not sure about the social situations to meet up with them. Now, I'm not an introvert. I don't have a problem speaking to women. You know, I'm not this super shy guy that can't speak to women, but it's simply the opportunities aren't there. Online dating, okay, that's possible, but it costs money. My membership's expired. When I can, I will probably rejoin eHarmony, but it costs money, and we're in a cost of living crisis. So it just isn't practical right now. Therefore, I know I have to move on. I know I have to focus my mind on other things, and I cannot let my experience of her dominate everything. I can't do that. But at the same time, I can wake up tomorrow and she's just gone from my mind. That won't happen until I meet someone else, or until something changes in my life, and I'm working to try and make that happen. But the general mentality of just move on, it's dismissive. Like I say, it's in of itself, it's not wrong, because ultimately we do have to move on, especially if it's affecting other people. So if you are, let's say someone has suffered loss, let's just give this example. They've suffered loss, maybe they've lost their husband or their wife, and they then become distant from their children. Well, that's affecting the children because they're basically abandoning them because they're so hung up in their grief. So there are situations like that where moving on is essential in order to not impact other people. And as a basic point for our own mental health, it's very important. But it does annoy me when people just act like it's a simple thing to do. It really, really isn't. Um, and that's it, really. I'm not going to make this one too long because I tend to, some of my videos perhaps are longer than they really need to be. But for this one, it's just something to think about. Telling people to just move on, it's doesn't help. Um, Now, I suppose the other side of the argument is um, it's important also to encourage people to find ways to help themselves to move on. So, um, constantly talking about a problem, probably when you're not going to get solutions. In the case of ghosting, you can analyze it, micro-analyze it, but ultimately, to use a cliche, in the end of the day, you can work out the behavior, you can find the reasoning why they've done what they've done or whatever, but ultimately you can't control it. They've done what they've done. So ultimately you do have to focus on, well, what can I do for myself in this situation? She or he is not going to change their approach. They've done this for whatever reason. So trying to work out, even then, it doesn't necessarily give closure. The only thing that would give closure is if the person apologizes or they come back, and even then, it's highly unlikely that they will. Unfortunately, with something like this, and this is why ghosting is so hard, it's not like with a breakup, it can be painful, it can be disappointing, but at least you know what the other person's position is. At least you know, okay, well, their mindset's different. They don't think about this the way I do, and that's hard. But at least you know what it is. With ghosting, especially in a situation where there's been no animosity, there's been no argument, there's been no difference of positions, although maybe the person was keeping it to themselves. But that is why I think it's cowardly to just leave without saying anything, because you're not giving the other person closure. That's cowardly and it's selfish. Um, rejecting someone isn't easy. I've had to do it, but there are ways to do it that's legitimate, that allows you to say what you need to say whilst not being, whilst considering the other person. So, for example, I met a woman on the site, and She had this thing about she had certain conditions which I just didn't it didn't align with what I was looking for. She was quite attractive and she seemed like a decent person, but she was talking, for example, about a relative coming to live with us, and I thought that's no, it's not going to work. So anyway, I messaged her and I tried to make it thoughtful and sensitive, and I said honestly, she was an attractive person and I liked her, and I made it quite lengthy because I really wanted to get the tone right, and I said, look, it's not going to work out. Um, and there was a distance factor and there's other factors. And incidentally, it was actually at the time I was meeting my ghoster, so I was also investing in a relationship with her. Anyway, I know what it's like to have to reject someone as well, so it's not easy, but it's the right thing to do. If let's just say that other woman who'd been getting close to me, I just said nothing. I think sometimes ghosters have this idea, well, they should take a hint. If I'm not getting back to them, they should take a hint. And maybe, what's a cut-off point when the person knows they're being ghosted? Probably it's a few weeks. Yeah, I knew I was being ghosted a long time ago. It wasn't like this is a new thing. But that's the point. It doesn't come immediately. So that advice, just move on immediately, is stupid because it actually takes a bit of time to even know you're being ghosted. It's not like, well, I haven't got back to me today or this week, because, that would be a bit ridiculous. Maybe they do need space for whatever reason, but when it starts getting into weeks, then you know you're being ghosted. Anyway, I'll wrap this up, but I just wish people would have a little bit more empathy and understanding. I know that's idealistic, it's not the world that we're in, but the other sad thing about ghosting, incidentally, is I saw one of these self-help videos. These sort of self-styled relationship advisors, and he said, "Oh, a lot of people ghost today. It's the world we live in," and that would be a very sad indictment of modern society if it is really that common, where we really have a situation where people feel there's no obligation to consider the other person. That's just sad, and it shows how selfish people have become. And I hope it's not as widespread as he implies, because that's, you know, to me, a responsible adult will be upfront with the other person. Now, there's an onus on the other person to accept it ultimately, but I just think being upfront with someone is a matter of respect and consideration. Um, so yeah, anyway, I'll leave it at that, but this is something to think about. Just move on. It's lazy and it doesn't help. Ultimately, people do need to move on, but telling them that in such an abrupt way, without looking at the nuances, without looking at the detail, without looking at the way that person is misled. To me, it also feels like victim blaming almost. It's almost implying that the person is overly sensitive or needy. I think it's wrong, but that's just me. Let me know your thoughts. Please keep it respectful. Um, Trolls will not be tolerated. Thanks for watching.